I'm not sure my question is ready, but I was happy to hear that the Sutta says that if your attention is suffused in the body, or however it's put, that there's not room for hindrances to come in there. Do you have any personal experiences of that you can relate to us? I mean, I'm glad the Buddha said it, but we got to test it out ourselves. And so I'm trying to think of my own experiences, and I guess I don't necessarily have a good indicator of when I'm suffused in the body. I've been dealing with my dog dying, and I notice that the more presence I have in my body and then my own experience, the more, not that like grief is a hindrance, but there's less room for grief to be there. But is it the trivial aspect that my mind is absorbed in experiencing the present moment that doesn't allow other things in? Maybe it's too much of an intellectual question, but it's.
I think, Michael, it's a really fair question. And when I read that myself, I went, really? Wow.
It seems so simple.
It seems very simple, and it's like, what's happening? But if I just like unpack it with you right now, one of the things that I can notice is that when my attention is suffused throughout my body, one of the signatures of that is relaxation. And when I'm relaxed, then that also gives me much more resource and resiliency. And I'm much more able to navigate the stuff that otherwise sends me into anxiety or reactivity. So from that perspective, I get it. I get it.
It's like it's more expansive almost when you're in your body. It's harder to get locked down on these things.
Yeah. But it's a fair question of how do we actually experience that ourselves. And so maybe that could be a question to mull or to ponder, is to check and see, is this true for you? So the Buddha said it, but is it true for you? And if it is true for you, how do you experience it? And if it's not true for you, what is your experience instead? So very important. Yeah. And I just want to say that I've been thinking of you and wondering how it's been going, because I just, furry family members, it's not a small thing when they pass. So you've been on my heart, and so has your furry person.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's better today.
Yeah.
It may not be better tomorrow.
Yeah.
Just to say one thing though. When I was writing, I was relatively new to practice, but I was still kind of fresh with practice when my dad passed away very suddenly. And I just noticed then that being fully present for the grief and the feelings that I had somehow allowed me to get process faster. So I kind of moved through that so much faster than my siblings did. So I'm trying to be careful to be fully present for my feelings for my dog.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
And also what's interesting is sometimes with animals, it can be, though it doesn't have to be, that the grief is deeper because the relationship is much less complicated, And so people can just get knocked sideways because of the lack of complexity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of my other friends I was describing was a good kind of lesson on lowering the barrier between self and other, because it's like small kids you meet in the park. Somehow I can more instantly bond with them, just get the less of a wall to climb over. So it was a good lesson for me. I've never had that experience with an animal before.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, Terry?
So I'm trying to use this first paper as sort of a touchstone, which is
The different kinds of joy.
the different kinds of joy, self-relational and societal. And I'm trying to reconcile it with so much of the practice being insular, right? It's so, shut off the day-to-day life and just sort of be able to have some time to go inward. But it seems to me that is so that you're able to go out again, right, and establish those relational and societal bonds. Is that correct?
Well, I think we need to actually start from a completely different frame of reference, which is that if we go to India 2,600 years ago, there is no such thing as an individual independent person. It just absolutely does not have any context whatsoever. So our sense of self is completely enmeshed, and wedded to all of these relationships of family, of clan, of ancestors, of location, of work, of whatever. So from the Buddha's perspective, from that time and that context of a traditional society, the isolation was a complete contrast to daily life, which was immersion in a relational field, okay? And so then we fast forward 2,600 years and we have completely ruptured relational fields. And then we have this imported meditation practice that says that meditation in silence is like the way to go, you know? So we have ruptured relational fields where we don't have cohesive senses of belonging. And then we think that the way to cure this is to pack ourselves into a cave for 100 years and not talk to anybody. And that somehow that's going to be the way to complete freedom. And guess what? Maybe not so much. So what I want to do is sit in the truth of what is happening now to bring forward the blessings, the power, the benefits of the wisdoms, the Buddha's wisdom, but in a culturally appropriate way that takes into account where we're at, and then begins to give like parallel practices and paths that support us where we need to. So like, how many times have you ever heard a meditation teacher, what's absent in the sutta is they don't talk about relaxation, you know? But for me, it's obvious that it's not there because I deal with needing to relax a lot, you know? So I look at my own personal experience and I use that in contrast. Well, okay, yeah, the Buddha is the Buddha. I don't ever claim to be as smart as the Buddha, but the Buddha's not me. And I am me. I know what it's like having to navigate this, you know? And so that's what I'm constantly trying to do, is to bring the teachings into where we're actually dealing with right now in a way that gives us the ballast and the leverage to move forward into a place of wholeness that includes all of the blessings that the Buddha speaks about, but is not limited to just the context that he was talking about. And so that's part of the reason why relational happiness and societal happiness is on that list. Because let's take it another way. I was at another spiritual community with a day-long the other day. And in one of my groups, I was in the group with two people of color. And one of them was like all over the map about the agony of racism, okay? It's like, it's what she's lived and breathed and had to deal with since she was born, okay? The instruction and the dialogue had no place for that. There's no place in that school that deals with systemic oppression as a reality. It's all resolved on the personal and the inquiry level, okay? So when you take a systemic oppression that you did not willfully have anything to do with, so there's nothing in your personal intention that set up the conditions for that, and you're trying to resolve that through meditation and inquiry, there's this massive disconnect. And that massive disconnect ends up being an additional burden that the people who are the most impacted by the oppression are having to carry. So for me, to put these things up there like that is like, okay, let's set the stage that we're not doing that. Now, to actually create a system that navigates the interpersonal, the relational, and the societal is not a small thing. But we can say that these things need to be addressed. And it is fascinating to me, once again, that the Buddha very, very, very rarely speaks about systemic oppression. Here we are.
So standard descriptions of Sila have nothing to do with that sort of thing, because there was not a class struggle like that in India? Or?
They had their own class struggles. They did, but and the Buddha was revolutionary in his way by wanting to eliminate the caste system, by inviting women to be fully ordained members in a society where women had no autonomy. So he, in his own way, he was completely revolutionary and above and beyond what was happening in that time. But they don't have frames of reference for understanding that, like, the Buddha speaks, there are instructions on how to take care of slaves. There's a proper way to take care of your slaves. There's no idea that having a slave might not be so politically correct. If you've got a slave, there's a proper way of taking care of them. So we can't say that all the things that the Buddha did culturally apply, So there has been some movement in the way that our society is organized.
Can I just
Yes.
say, what you were talking about made me, I'm in the middle of this book called She Said, and it's by these two New York Times reporters who broke open the Harvey Weinstein, sexual harassment, abuse, all this stuff. And what was very striking to me, and I'm sorry this is a tangent, but it just really resonated. These women had, talk about limbic injury, right, for years, just sort of like had this happen to them and felt such shame they could not talk about it. And they didn't know that others had the same thing going. And it was, so there's just like scores of these women who suffered this kind of abuse for so long, and it was only after a few brave ones stepped forward, and there was this just rush of the Times had to get more reporters to take all the phone calls that were coming in after the story broke. I mean, it's this whole thing about changing societal and relational, but you can't do it in isolation. It has to come out. So that's, I don't know, it just sort of resonated. I'm totally on a tangent, but it just really...
It isn't on a tangent because it's in our face all the time. And right now in our world and in the news, it's everywhere. And so, for me to talk about, part of the reason why this is an interesting class for me is that when I came out of the monastic life, I was heartbroken. And part of the reason why I was heartbroken was because it's devastating to me that I couldn't find a sense of wholeness in monastic life. I couldn't find a sense of community belonging, and I couldn't find a sense of wholeness, and I didn't find a sense of safety. And it's not possible to talk about it, okay? And so it's not possible to talk about it because the value is that it's supposed to be there, and that in order for monastics to continue, you've got to presume that all of those things are operating. And so it's risky and threatening to actually speak about what is really going on. And so in addition to the heartbreak, I've got this total isolation that there's very few people that I can actually speak to about. And so part of what happened for me personally a little bit is that I threw the Buddha out with the bathwater. Mm-hmm. In the sense of, like, if this system creates this level of dysfunction, what's good about the system, And so without kind of realizing it, it wasn't a conscious, deliberate action. It was just like when you're heartbroken, you just kind of do what you do, and then you pick up the pieces afterwards. But part of the reason why this class interests me, it's like a redo. I get to be badass and speak my truth, but not in the way where I'm having to drink bathwater. It's like I can say that these things are true and this is true and this is true, but I don't have to get it all mixed up. And that to me is healing. So this course is healing for me to be able to do this. So thank you.
I
I was interested in the Will Johnson article, and then I got one of his books, and this idea of movement, of, one of the things that's always made me crazy, has always triggered me, is the instruction, sit down and shut up. And I don't want to sit down and shut up, right? I really just, it's really had a hard time with that. And so, that's the instruction, sit still and be quiet. And I just really, it was just really great to read somebody who's saying, well, maybe you don't have to sit down and shut up, and maybe there's some, maybe there's more to it than that. And I really appreciated that, you bringing that in.
Yeah, if you haven't read the article that I gave the link to, I would encourage you to read it, because it's mind-boggling. The level of nuances and subtlety in the body posture, and how this simple thing like rocking can be so hugely important. And even though we haven't yet found how to do that without a willful effort, when we get the rhythm of it, it only needs to be this tiny little slight movement. But this tiny little slight movement ends up making all the difference in the world between us freezing and to being able to stay connected to what's happening. So his work is fabulous. And rather than spend, half a minute on meditation, he spends like 5 days on the posture, where you just, through the posture and the nuances of the posture, you feel the fullness of awareness suffusing the body. It's awesome.
Something I noticed from that, I went home and was working with this whole movement of the body, is that I began to notice that it was happening anyway, that it had been happening all along, and that I just had been focusing so much on the stillness that I had kind of forgotten that the body was already doing its own thing, and that's where a lot of the relaxation began to come in, was that when I just realized it was already doing it. I didn't need to do anything. It was already there.
That's exactly right. It's already there. And so what we need to start interrupting is the mechanism that shuts that down, which what sometimes happens when we think what we're supposed to do is to sit still. Sit still means that we shut down that natural movement, and when we shut that down, there's all kinds of negative consequences that happen, Yes.
I would like some help understanding the statement about like a full awareness, consciousness of the body really helps eliminate defilements. I'm struggling with that. I'm thinking of my own little simplistic examples, so I'll give you one, but I'd love to hear some other ones. I mean, my current understanding of it is, if you're fully alive and present to your body, if I am, then one of the things that comes up is that it's changing all the time. And to me, one of the defilements would be, I don't like this feeling. I want this to go away. Kind of a grasping for some kind of ease or tranquility in the body, and an avoidance of anything that's unpleasant. But if I really watch both pleasant or unpleasant, I guess what I see is that they're endlessly changing. There's nothing permanent about the body. So is that what we mean? Is that what we're exploring when we say?
Well, I think rather than me answer, I think what we need to do is to each of us take that on board as like a question.
Yeah.
The Buddha says that this is the case, and he's given some examples that are similes that suggest this is the case. And so I think let's take this on as like a question in our own practice to explore, is this true? Is this true for you? How is it true for you? It might not be true for you. And if it's not true for you, what is your experience? So rather than take it on and try to understand its rightness, take it on and see, question, is it your experience?
Mhm. Okay.
And then we can share. You can share with your buddies, you can share. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, for me, it definitely seems true that like, if my awareness is totally suffusing my body, then it's pretty easy not to let defilements overwhelm me. But that's not the tricky part, right? It's like when I'm in ordinary life, or I wake up in the middle of a trauma space. That's the hard part. So it's like, it's easy to say that like, oh, once you get to nirvana, then you don't have any problems. Yeah, but I don't know. That seems like, and it's been my experience also that like I had a couple of kind of related questions about your talk, and one was the idea that there's no lasting satisfaction in the self. When he says that, isn't he talking about the soul? I mean, and isn't that what they were talking about 2,500 years ago, like a lot? Whether there's like this soul that each of us has, this atta, and he's saying no, there isn't. Everything's fluid and
In the Anatalakkhana
impermanent.
Sutta, he says that if it changes, it can't bring lasting happiness.
Yeah.
And if it can't bring lasting happiness, then we can't depend on it as who and what we are. So there's this connection between change, unsatisfactoriness, and not self. They're linked together. So in this situation, he's not talking about it as that the changeability is speaking to the soul. It's just talking about, sight and sound and smell and taste and belief and thoughts and, the stuff that comes and goes. But for many of us, we can have an angry thought and then come to the conclusion, I'm angry, rather than an angry thought is arising and I'm experiencing it now, which is not just splitting hairs, it's a different way of relating to what's happening, and that different way of relating to what's happening gives us some leverage, and that leverage makes it possible to choose where we focus our attention. And where we focus our attention then determines what we experience, and how we relate to that experience completely conditions our own reality. So what appears to be splitting hairs actually gives us a fulcrum to lift the entire universe.
I think it's very, I can do the practice of, okay, I'm having an angry thought, and that's very helpful in dealing with anger. And I can sort of hold it with compassion, and move through it in a way. But that's sort of a different thing than like my awareness is totally suffusing my body. That's a different state that I can be in when I'm actually off in the forest or in a little hut, and I've gotten really quiet, and usually there's not other people around, and there's a total sense of fluidity and spaciousness and that sort of thing. But that's sort of like a different thing.
So I think maybe part of what we're navigating is that the reality of urban living, with the electromagnetic and the cell phone and the texting and the flashing lights and the input and the expectation, is actually hugely difficult to have awareness suffused in our body. That I think when we're, I know when I'm in the forest or I'm by the ocean or I'm by a stream, it's like night and day in terms of the level of relaxation I feel, how much more of my body I'm aware of, the sense of ease and well-being. So I think part of what we might be navigating is not just a meditation conundrum, but a meditation in modern urban environments conundrum. And I don't think there's a simple answer to this. I think this is one of the koans that we all are sitting with, of how do we actually do this? Not as like lip service or like goody-goody meditators, but like, how do we do this? And with the different levels of sensitivity that we each have, it's going to look different for each of us. You know?
I mean, for me, it's almost a question of, am I being reactive, or am I using skillful filtering to deal with like the assault on my senses that happens just when I walk down the street in downtown San Francisco, and that's almost like, yeah, I could get totally suffused and then just walk down the street and just be like hit between the eyes by the stuff that I see and hear.
That I think might be, let's put a question mark around that, because, I'm in the middle of this myself. I'm dealing with a bunch of health stuff, and the health stuff makes mine more sensitive. And as I get healthier, I'm noticing different things. But so there's a question in that about if we are totally suffused, if it makes us more sensitive or more resilient. So let's put a question mark there and tag it and come back to it, because that's an important point. Yes, Louis?
Just thinking about my experience, it seems like I can't speak for whether it's impossible to experience violence. Like I've gotten there, but with both desire and aversion, it seems like if I'm experiencing those in a really challenging way, my awareness is located outside of my body. Like if it's desire, it's on the thing I want, and if it's maybe a conceptual desire, and then my awareness is kind of like, that's where I am. And if I'm like in my body, then my focus, there's less magnetism from the thing I'm feeling desire of, because there's maybe more ability to feel well-being, kind of like we talked about in the one day, notice that things feel good, and less of a sense of lack. And on the aversion side, kind of the same. I feel like if the more embodied I'm feeling, the more likely, if I'm feeling aversion, and instead of experiencing like I'm so angry about that was something today, but the more likely I am to feel like sadness or fear, that are kind of like the I don't know, the states, the feelings that are underneath the more like higher frequency kind of anger or more challenging kinds of aversion. And I guess the same would be true of what you said, Marcy, about ignorance, and if you're in your body, maybe you're feeling change more, and you're not in a kind of disembodied conceptual space of fixing a concept.
So I'm loving this conversation, and I'm aware that we need to shift gears. So I would like, if it's okay, I'd like to pause and move into an inquiry question that has us working with each other relationally on a particular prompt. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Can I hand over to you?
Yeah.